Police arrested a woman on a lonely road and laughed when she tried to call her husband. They had no idea her husband was none other than Chuck Norris. Minutes later, their laughter turned to panic as a simple stop became a nightmare. Subscribe and comment where in the world you're watching this video from. The Texas sky was deep and bruised with the fading color of dusk when Gina Norris steered her SUV down the long stretch of county highway that wound toward home. The road shimmered faintly with heat that still clung to the pavement, though the day's sun had already slipped beneath the tree line. A playlist hummed low through the speakers, the kind of easy country tune that brought a soft calm to her thoughts. She had spent the afternoon visiting a small animal shelter outside of Tyler, helping organize supplies for a charity drive, something she liked to do when Chuck was away on set. These quiet drives home had become her ritual, a rare pocket of stillness between her own work, her family, and the whirlwind orbit of being married to a man whose name everyone seemed to know. She smiled faintly as she passed the faded billboard that marked the last 10 miles to their ranch. The headlights caught the silver of barbed wire fences and the silhouettes of longhorns grazing in the fading light. She was thinking about dinner, maybe calling one of the kids to check in, when the glare of flashing blue lights filled her rearview mirror. The sound of the siren, a single sharp chirp, snapped through the calm. Her hands reflexively tightened on the wheel. She glanced at the speedometer. 55, exactly the limit. No broken taillight, no weaving, nothing that should draw attention. Still, she signaled, slowed, and guided the SUV to the gravel shoulder beside a field of knee-high grass. The tires crunched softly as she stopped. Her heart beat faster than it should have, but she took a steadying breath. Chuck always said nerves were just preparation without purpose control them, and they'd serve you. The patrol car pulled up behind her, headlights flooding the interior. In the mirror, she saw two shapes emerge, both young, tall, broad-shouldered in their pressed tan uniforms. One adjusted his belt, the other fixed his cap before swaggering toward her window. Their posture said it all. They weren't here to protect. They were here to command. The first officer leaned down, his flashlight beam slicing across her face. "Evening, ma'am," he said, the drawl thick enough to sound rehearsed. "License and registration." "Of course." Gina's voice was polite, steady. She retrieved her purse from the passenger seat, pulling out her wallet. The second officer circled the vehicle, shining his light through the back seat like he was expecting to find something. The first one squinted at her license. "Mrs. Gina Norris." His mouth curved into a smirk. "That name sounds familiar. You related to that actor guy?" She smiled faintly. "He's my husband." That earned a low whistle from the one by the rear window. "No kidding. So what's a movie star's wife doing out here all by her lonesome on a Friday night?" Gina kept her expression neutral. "Volunteering. Just heading home." The two exchanged a look. Something in it made her stomach tighten. "You sure you weren't speeding, ma'am?" the first asked. "We clocked you a little high." 55, she said calmly. "On a 55 road." He said, tapping the license against his flashlight. "Funny, my radar said otherwise. Maybe we should check the car, make sure everything's in order." "There's no need," she said, forcing a polite tone. "All my paperwork is valid. You can see that." The second officer came around, folding his arms. His flashlight beam hovered deliberately low, tracing the hem of her blouse. "Sometimes people like to hide things," he said. "Can't be too careful." Her pulse jumped. She'd been in uncomfortable situations before, especially in small towns where a woman alone was easy sport for board authority. But something about these two felt different. There was no humor in their eyes, only an eager cruelty masked as procedure. She took a slow breath. "Officers, I'd like to know the reason for this stop." "Reason," the first one repeated, mock offense in his tone. "We can stop anyone we want, ma'am, especially when they look nervous." "I'm not nervous." "Could have fooled me," said the second, grinning. He dropped his flashlight to the gravel with a clatter. "Oops, mind picking that up for me?" She stared at him, the insult landing exactly where he wanted it to. "I don't think so," she said quietly. The smile vanished. The silence that followed was colder than the night air. "All right, step out of the vehicle," the first officer said finally, the friendliness gone from his voice. Gina hesitated. "Am I being detained?" He leaned closer, the beam of his light harsh on her face. Step out of the car. The command carried the weight of something that wasn't about law. It was about power. She opened the door, the hinges groaning, and stepped into the muggy air. Gravel bit into the heels of her boots. The younger one, the one called Cole. She caught the name from his badge moved around to block her path. The other, Bradley, stayed near the door, arms folded. "Pop the trunk," Bradley said. "I don't consent to a search," she answered. Cole laughed softly. "You hear that, Brad? She doesn't consent." Bradley shrugged. "Guess we'll just have to make sure she's got nothing to hide." Before she could protest, he leaned in and hit the release latch himself. The trunk lifted. He rifled through her bags, tossing her jacket onto the gravel. A bottle of water rolled out, cracked, spilling at her feet. "Look at this," he said, lifting her leather purse with 2 fingers. "You sure you didn't pick this up on Rodeo Drive? Please put that down." He smirked. "Or what?" The second officer circled her again, like a predator checking its angle. "Bet your husband buys you all kinds of things, huh? Fancy cars, jewelry. Must be nice." Her patience snapped. "Enough." The single word cut through the night, firm and sharp. "Return my property and let me go." For a moment, neither moved. Then Bradley dropped the purse back into the trunk, his smirk widening. "Ma'am, you need to calm down. You're getting a little aggressive." She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Aggressive? I've done nothing wrong." Cole stepped closer, too close. His breath smelled of coffee and something metallic. "You raising your voice to an officer?" "Back away," she said quietly. He didn't. He touched her arm, slow and deliberate, a challenge disguised as restraint. "Relax," he murmured. "We're just doing our job." Her heart hammered. She took a step back, but he followed. "I said that's enough." Bradley moved in. "Resisting now, are we?" Before she could answer, they were both on her hands, grabbing her wrists, twisting them behind her back. Pain flared through her shoulders as metal cuffs bit into her skin. "This is unlawful," she said through clenched teeth. Bradley pushed her toward the SUV, pressing her against the hood. The metal was still warm from the day's heat. "You should have cooperated," he said, leaning close to her ear. "Could have been easy." Her phone slipped from her pocket and clattered to the ground. She turned her head just enough to see Cole step on it, grinding it into the gravel with the heel of his boot. The screen splintered, the soft glow dying under the pressure. He looked down at her. "Now there's nobody to call, Mrs. Norris." For the first time that night, fear truly reached her. Not for herself. She could handle pain, humiliation, even fear. But for what this meant, for what kind of men were given badges in this place. She thought of Chuck, of how he always said the world didn't need more fighters. It needed people who knew when to fight back. Her breath came shallow as she straightened her back against the hood, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Somewhere a dog barked in the distance, the sound lonely and echoing. Bradley wiped sweat from his brow. "You sure she's clean?" Cole grinned. "Guess we'll find out at the station." "I'm not going anywhere with you," she said. "Lady, you don't have a choice." They hauled her upright, one on each arm, and marched her toward the patrol car. The cuffs cut deeper, the metal scraping her wrists raw. She stared straight ahead, refusing to look at them. Her silence was the only power she still had. As they reached the car, a faint vibration stirred in her other pocket, the secondary phone Chuck had insisted she keep. They didn't notice. She twisted her hand just enough to hit the side button, calling the only number that mattered. It rang once, twice, then his voice, calm, warm, familiar. "Gina." Her throat closed. She barely managed a whisper. "Don't come." "Gina, what's going on?" "Just remember that I love you." There was a pause, long and heavy. "Where are you?" Before she could answer, Cole spotted the faint light from her pocket. He cursed, snatched the phone, and hurled it into the ditch. "You don't get to make calls, sweetheart." The screen cracked, the sound sharp as breaking glass. Bradley laughed, shaking his head. "Who was that, huh? Gonna call the cavalry?" Gina stared at them, something changing behind her eyes. The fear burned away, leaving only steel. "You just made the worst mistake of your lives." They exchanged a glance, still laughing, not understanding. "Yeah? And who's gonna save you now?" From down the road, a faint rumble grew. At first it blended with the wind, the hum of insects. Then it deepened, steadier, heavier. Headlights appeared on the horizon, cutting a white path through the dark. Gina looked toward the light, her bruised wrists trembling, but her expression calm. She whispered under her breath, almost to herself, "You'll see." The officers turned, squinting into the glare. The engine's growl grew louder as the truck approached, slowing just before the patrol car. Dust rose around the tires, swirling through the beams of light. The driver's door opened, slow and deliberate. The man who stepped out moved with quiet certainty, his shadow long against the road. The night seemed to hold its breath. Gina closed her eyes for one brief second, relief flooding through her chest. They didn't know it yet, but help had already come, and the world was about to remind them who they had dared to touch. The engine ticked softly in the heat, the silence hanging heavy as the dust settled. The quiet road no longer felt so empty. It felt like judgment. The night pressed in on all sides, the smell of dust and gasoline thick in the air. The glow from the patrol car's lights flickered over the stretch of road where Gina stood, her wrists still cuffed, her breath shallow and uneven. Behind her, the sound of the approaching truck's engine had faded into silence. For the officers, it was just another vehicle passing through the dark. For her, it was the heartbeat of something righteous and unstoppable drawing closer, though they didn't yet understand the meaning of that sound. They were too wrapped up in their own arrogance, too eager to savor their imagined victory. Bradley lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating his face, a flash of smug satisfaction in his eyes as if he had just put another arrogant citizen in their place. Cole leaned against the patrol car, scrolling through his own phone as though none of it mattered. The easy laughter between them was worse than shouting. It was the sound of two men convinced of their impunity. "Hell of a night," Bradley muttered, exhaling smoke toward the stars. "You ever think how easy it is to make 'em fold? One bit of pressure, and they start crying about rights and husbands and nonsense?" Cole grinned. "Somebody's got to remind them who's in charge. Half these people think a name means protection." Bet she thought that too. Gina didn't look at them, her eyes fixed on the road, where the dust had already settled after the truck's approach. She knew him well enough to understand that he wouldn't come in with noise and spectacle. When Chuck came, he came like a storm front, quiet at first, inevitable later. Cole pushed himself off the car and crouched beside her, letting the flashlight beam trail across her face. "You really gonna sit there all high and mighty? What, your famous husband gonna sue us?" He chuckled under his breath. "Maybe you can autograph my citation form." She didn't answer. There was no point. Words would only feed them, and silence was the only thing that unnerved bullies. The mockery shifted into something meaner. "I said something funny," he prodded her shoulder. "You think you're better than us?" Bradley watched with an amused smirk, blowing smoke rings into the dark. "Careful, Cole. These rich ones bruise easy." "I'm fine," Cole replied, his grin turning harder, just making sure she learned some respect. When she flinched back, the grin widened. He took her arm again, the grip bruising. "You got no idea how the world works, lady? You think the badge means we answer to someone?" She spoke then, her voice low and steady. "I think you'll find out soon enough." For a moment the words hung between them, simple and calm, but they carried a weight that made Bradley's smirk falter. He stepped closer, as if to reassert control. "You threatening us?" "No," she said. "You already did that to yourselves." Cole laughed, shaking his head, but there was a flicker of unease in his tone now, something small but noticeable. "You're real funny. Think you can talk your way out?" "I don't need to talk my way out," she said quietly. Bradley flicked the cigarette away, annoyed by her composure. "Get her up. Let's take her in. I'm done wasting time." Cole reached for her again, but before he could pull her up, the rumble of that same engine returned, louder now, deliberate. The men froze for a split second. Headlights appeared again in the distance, this time not passing by, but slowing as they approached. Bradley muttered, "Who the hell is that?" He squinted through the glare, shielding his eyes. The truck stopped a few yards behind the patrol car, its headlights cutting through the dust. The engine idled, low and deep, before finally shutting off. A silence fell, thicker than before. Probably some local, Cole said, though his voice wasn't confident anymore. Ignore it. But Gina's breath steadied, and in the faint glow of the car lights, a hint of calm came over her face, the first real sign of peace since the ordeal began. Bradley noticed the change. What's so funny? Nothing, she said. You'll see. Cole started toward the new arrival, one hand resting on his belt, the other brushing dust from his uniform. Hey, he shouted. Road's closed. Turn it around. The truck door opened with a slow creak, followed by the sound of boots hitting gravel. The silhouette that stepped out was tall, broad-shouldered, and unhurried. The light caught the faint glint of a badge clipped to a leather belt, but it wasn't law enforcement. It was a veteran's ID tag, dull from years of wear. Sir, Bradley called out, squaring his stance, this is an active stop. You need to back up your vehicle. The man didn't answer. He walked forward, the sound of his steps measured, the kind of rhythm that came from a lifetime of discipline. Each step seemed to draw the air tighter, as though the night itself recognized authority when it heard it. Gina closed her eyes for half a breath, whispering so softly that only she could hear it. You came. Chuck stopped a few paces from the men. He didn't look angry, not yet. His face was unreadable, but the silence carried a tension that neither officer could interpret correctly. I said stop, Bradley barked. Chuck looked at him then. Just one look, steady, unflinching, old as war, and Bradley took half a step back before catching himself. This is police business, he said quickly. Step away. Chuck's voice was quiet. That woman you've got in cuffs, she's my wife. The sentence landed with the weight of a verdict. Cole laughed first, trying to regain control. Your wife? That right? Then maybe you can explain why she's resisting arrest. Chuck's eyes didn't move from Gina. Did she resist? Cole hesitated. She was non-compliant, got mouthy. The silence stretched. Gina stood a few feet away, blood dried along her cheek, the glint of the broken phone on the ground beside her. She didn't move. Chuck finally looked at Cole, then at Bradley. His expression remained calm, but there was something in the stillness that made both men uneasy. You put your hands on her? Bradley bristled. She was obstructing. Did you put your hands on her? Chuck repeated. His tone didn't rise, but the precision of it left no room for evasion. Neither spoke. Cole shifted his weight, his hand inching toward the holster at his side, more out of nerves than intent. Chuck saw it. The movement was all the permission he needed. The next seconds happened faster than thought. Chuck moved like water, no wasted motion, no hesitation. His hand caught Cole's wrist, twisting it away from the gun, before the younger man even realized he was disarmed. A shift of weight, a turn of the hips, and Cole hit the gravel hard, the wind driven out of his chest. Bradley shouted, reaching for his baton. Chuck stepped into him, one arm blocking the swing, the other driving an open palm into his chest. The air filled with the sound of a grunt, a wheeze, the heavy thud of boots scraping across gravel. Gina turned her head, wincing, not from fear but from the release of it. She had seen him train, had watched years of muscle memory and restraint honed to art. But this was different. This wasn't a movie set or a controlled sparring session. This was her husband's discipline meeting the raw ugliness of injustice. Bradley tried again, swinging wildly. Chuck sidestepped, grabbed his forearm, and used his own momentum to flip him over the hood of the patrol car. The metal dented under the impact. The cigarette pack in Bradley's pocket scattered across the ground. Cole groaned, trying to crawl up. Chuck turned, crouched beside him, and spoke in that same even tone. Stay down. Cole froze. The fight had left his body, replaced by the dawning realization that they had misjudged everything about this night. Gina's wrists ached as she tried to move, the cuffs cutting deeper. Chuck saw it, crossed to her side, and unclipped the key from Bradley's belt without looking at him. The cuffs snapped open, falling to the ground with a metallic clang that echoed down the empty road. He took her hands, inspecting the red marks, his expression softening. Are you hurt? Only my pride, she said, her voice shaking with relief. He smiled faintly, brushing her cheek with the back of his knuckles. You held your ground. I didn't want to call you, she said. I thought, I know, he interrupted gently. You shouldn't have had to. Behind them, Bradley started to stir, a low groan breaking the moment. Chuck turned, his calm returning like a drawn blade being sheathed. Don't move, he said. Bradley froze mid-motion, his hand hovering near his radio. You just assaulted 2 officers, he rasped. Chuck's reply was quiet. No, I just stopped 2 criminals from committing a felony. He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed. Torrens, he said when the line picked up. It's Chuck. I need you to send federal investigators to County Road 18, near mile marker 62. 2 officers in violation of civil and federal law. Get them here now. Gina watched the faces of the men pale as their reality settled in. There was no bluff in his tone, no exaggeration. The name he'd called wasn't for Show Sam. Torrens was a former Army investigator, now head of the state's Internal Affairs Bureau. Within minutes, the distant wail of sirens began again. Different this time, not triumphant, but answering. Bradley swallowed hard, voice cracking. You think you can just waltz in here and... Chuck looked at him, and whatever argument had started died on the man's tongue. He gestured toward the ditch. Sit down, both of you. Cole didn't argue. He sank to the gravel beside his partner, chest heaving. Bradley hesitated until Chuck's eyes met his again. Then he sat. The new cruisers appeared from the direction of town, lights slicing through the night. The first agent out was Torrens himself, his gray hair catching the reflection of the headlights. He saw Chuck, then Gina, then the 2 men on the ground, and his expression darkened. What the hell happened? Chuck handed him Bradley's badge. They stopped her. No probable cause, physical assault, destruction of evidence, false detention. Torrens turned on the officers. That true? Bradley stammered. She was resisting. Cameras were off, Chuck said quietly. They turned them off. Torrens sighed heavily. We'll handle it from here. He nodded to his team. Take them in. As the agents cuffed the 2 officers, Gina stood beside her husband, her hands trembling as adrenaline began to ebb. The night was finally quiet again, save for the rustle of paper and the radio chatter of law enforcement documenting the scene. Torrens gave Chuck a look somewhere between gratitude and exhaustion. You always find the trouble, don't you? Chuck shook his head. I don't find it. It finds her. That earned the faintest smile from the older man. We'll make this right, I promise. I know you will, Chuck said. When it was done, the vehicles pulled away one by one, leaving the dark road as it had been hours earlier, lonely still, and echoing with the sound of insects in the grass. Gina leaned against him, the warmth of his arm around her, the first safe thing she'd felt all night. I didn't want to need you tonight, she said softly. He tilted his head, smiling against her hair. You didn't. You just reminded them who you were. She looked up at him, the stars reflected in her eyes. And who are you tonight? He glanced toward the horizon where the flashing lights disappeared, his voice low, almost to himself. Just a man making sure the world remembers there's still a line you don't cross. The night closed around them again, but this time it wasn't suffocating. It was calm. They stood there a long time before heading home, the hum of cicadas blending into the whisper of wind across the empty highway. The danger had passed, but its echo lingered, a promise that what had been broken tonight would soon be made right. And somewhere beyond the hills, the faintest glow of dawn began to show, chasing the last of the darkness away. The night had burned itself down to a cold stillness by the time they drove home, and though the air was calm, Gina's mind was not. The echo of what had happened, the hands on her arms, the cruel laughter, the split second before the headlights appeared, played on a loop in her thoughts. Chuck had driven in silence for the first few miles, the way he always did when his anger ran too deep for words. She knew that silence. It wasn't restraint, it was precision, the slow gathering of a man who never let rage steer him, but used it instead as fuel for purpose. When they reached their driveway, dawn was only beginning to stain the horizon. The open fields glowed faintly silver with dew, the world washed clean as though the night had never existed. But the small bruises on her wrists, the dull ache in her shoulders, the broken glass of her phone in her bag, those were reminders that evil didn't vanish when the sun rose. It just waited for another evening. Chuck parked the truck and sat for a long moment, his hands resting on the wheel. "You don't have to say anything yet," he said quietly. "You don't owe me that." Gina looked at him, her voice soft. "I wasn't going to. I'm still trying to understand how it happened, how people with that kind of power could enjoy it so much." "They don't enjoy the power," Chuck said. "They enjoy thinking no one will ever take it from them." He finally looked at her then, his gaze steady, sorrowful but sure. "They were wrong." She managed a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You came fast." "I was already on the way," he said simply. "The moment your voice broke on the phone, I knew where you were. I could hear the road noise, the echo of gravel. I knew the place." "You always know," she said. "I have to." They went inside the quiet house, greeted by the faint smell of cedar and coffee beans left from the morning before. The world inside was orderly, calm, frame by frame photos of their children and decades of memories. It was strange how normal it felt, how clean and safe everything seemed after the dirt and chaos of the roadside. She set her bag on the counter and stared at the cracked face of her phone, remembering how it had shattered under that man's boot. Something small and invisible broke again inside her. But this time it wasn't fear. It was resolve. She didn't want to be the kind of person who flinched at shadows. She'd stood too long beside a man who had built his life on discipline, who believed in standing between wrong and right. Tonight she'd seen that belief take form in flesh and bone. When the knock came at the door, neither of them jumped. Chuck had already been expecting it. He opened it to find Sam Torrance standing on the porch, his gray hair damp with early morning mist, his expression grave. "I didn't want to wait for the office," Torrance said. "Figured you'd both rather hear it straight." Chuck stepped aside and Torrance entered, his boots leaving small prints of water on the wood floor. "They're booked, both of them. Charges include unlawful detention, destruction of evidence, and assault. Their cameras were disabled, but the cruiser dash cam caught enough to back the rest of your account. And, well," he gave a faint, grim smile, "your timing couldn't have been better. We've had complaints on them before, but nothing that stuck. This time it's airtight." Gina exhaled, the tension leaving her shoulders for the first time in hours. "So it's over?" Torrance shook his head. "It's beginning. The DA wants statements, official ones. And when the press hears your name, your real name, it's going to get messy. You sure you're ready for that?" "I don't care about messy," she said. "I care about truth." Chuck's voice came from behind her, steady and calm. "We'll do it. Every word, every detail." Torrance nodded. "I figured you'd say that." He hesitated, his eyes softening as he looked at Gina. "You handled yourself better than most. I've seen strong people crumble after less." She gave a faint, tired laugh. "I didn't have much choice." "You did," Torrance said. "You could have called him the first time they touched you. You didn't. You kept your head. That counts for something." After he left, the silence returned, but it wasn't empty. It felt alive, charged with what would come next. Chuck poured coffee for both of them, setting a mug in front of her. Neither spoke for a while, the soft hum of the refrigerator and the creak of settling wood the only sounds. Finally she asked, "You think they'll try to bury this?" "Maybe," he said. "But they'll fail. You don't bury truth, you delay it." She sipped her coffee, wincing at the heat, and stared through the kitchen window. Beyond the glass, the sky had turned pale pink, and the first bird calls broke the silence. It struck her how surreal it was that nature could move on so quickly while she still felt frozen in the same moment. That day passed in a blur of interviews, paperwork, and phone calls. Reporters parked at the end of their long driveway by afternoon, cameras waiting, questions shouted through rolled-down windows. Chuck ignored them. He focused on his wife, on making sure she ate, on grounding her in the ordinary. But it was that night, when she tried to sleep, that the memories returned in sharp fragments. The smell of the officers' uniforms, the sound of laughter, the crunch of glass beneath a boot. She sat up, gasping, her hand instinctively reaching for the bedside lamp. Chuck woke immediately, his instincts wired to danger. "Nightmare?" "Not exactly," she said. "Memory." He sat up beside her, his presence solid and calming. "They can't touch you anymore." "I know," she paused. But I keep hearing them laugh. That kind of arrogance, it doesn't just come from nowhere. It's allowed. He studied her face for a moment, then nodded slowly. Then we don't stop with them. She looked at him. What do you mean? People like that get protected. It's never just two bad apples. It's the whole barrel that hides the rot. His words lit something in her. It wasn't anger. Not anymore. It was purpose. Then we find out who's protecting them. He smiled faintly. Now you sound like me. The following day they met again with Torrens, this time at his office in Austin. The place smelled of old paper and stale coffee, the kind of bureaucratic space where justice was more often talked about than done. But Torrens was different. He was weary, yes, but still believed in the work. He pulled out a file thick with reports. You were right, he told them. They've been covered before, complaints dismissed, evidence lost. Every time the same name signs off on the closure reports. He turned the file so they could see. Chief Grant Mallory. Chuck's brow furrowed. Mallory. I've heard that name. Former sheriff turned chief of police, Torrens said. He runs the department like a private club. And the mayor's office looks the other way. The officers who stopped you were part of his inner circle. They thought they were untouchable because, until now they were. Gina leaned forward. And now? Now they're the thread that unravels the whole thing, Torrens said. If you're willing to stand by your statement when this goes public. I'll do more than that, Gina said. I'll speak, on record, to anyone who will listen. Chuck nodded in agreement. You won't stand alone. The investigation began to move quickly. Federal oversight brought in new eyes, new questions, and soon the story broke nationally. The assault of a decorated veteran's wife by local law enforcement. But what the news didn't yet know was the deeper rot beneath it all. The deals, the falsified arrests, the money flowing quietly from private prisons into the pockets of city officials. Each night, as more information surfaced, Gina and Chuck sat together, reviewing every detail, connecting pieces Torrens' team uncovered. She was the one who noticed a pattern in the arrests, mostly minorities, mostly poor, all charged with minor offenses that ballooned into felony records. Each conviction fed the same prison contract, each one signed by Mallory himself. Profit by punishment, Chuck said grimly one evening, spreading the papers across their dining table. He's monetizing misery. And the people he hurts, she said softly, don't have anyone to fight for them. Chuck met her eyes. They do now. That night, as she stood outside on the porch, the sky clear and full of stars, she realized something had shifted inside her. Fear had given way to purpose, and that purpose was steadier than rage. She didn't want revenge anymore. She wanted truth, and she wanted it to echo loud enough that no one could pretend not to hear it. When she came back inside, Chuck was on the phone again, his voice low but firm. He was speaking with a producer friend, arranging for an interview, not a sensational one, but something real, something that could force the public to see beyond the headlines. When he hung up, she asked, "You think it'll matter?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with the quiet certainty that had always steadied her. The truth always matters. Sometimes it just needs a microphone. She reached for his hand. Then let's make sure everyone hears it. He squeezed her hand, smiling. Together. The last traces of night still hung at the edges of the world, but beyond their windows the first light of morning began to stretch across the fields. It felt like more than sunrise. It felt like the beginning of something larger, something irreversible. For the first time since that terrible night, Gina felt no fear in the silence. It was the sound of calm before justice, and she was ready for whatever came next. The morning after the first headlines broke, the Norris ranch was no longer a quiet place. Reporters gathered beyond the gates, their cameras pointed at the long driveway that wound toward the house. Trucks idled, microphones glittered in the sunlight, and drones buzzed faintly above the trees, searching for a glimpse of the couple who had become the center of a national storm. Yet inside the house, there was only calm. Chuck and Gina sat at their kitchen table, the same table where they'd eaten breakfast for years, and watched the chaos unfold through the curtains with the detachment of people who had already lived through something worse. Gina had been awake since before dawn. She'd stood on the porch with her coffee, the mist curling around her ankles, watching the horizon turn gold. The nightmares had quieted, replaced by a sharper awareness, a sense that her life had shifted into something she couldn't fully define. She wasn't just Chuck Norris's wife anymore. She had become a symbol, unwillingly at first, then consciously. When the world expected silence from her, she had chosen to speak, and now that choice had consequences that neither of them could fully predict. Chuck had barely slept either. He'd been on the phone most of the night, coordinating with Torrens and a team of attorneys who had volunteered to support them. His tone throughout had been steady, controlled, but Gina knew the signs of strain. His eyes gave him away. They were the same eyes she had seen on soldiers returning from war, tired, vigilant, unwilling to rest until the battle was truly over. By mid-morning, Torrens arrived again, his government sedan raising a trail of dust as it turned into the driveway. Chuck met him outside. The two men clasped hands like brothers who had shared something wordless between them long ago. Torrens looked older than he had the night before. The weight of bureaucracy showed in the way his shoulders sagged when he exhaled. "Things are moving faster than I expected," he said. "We've got the DA, the feds, and half the state legislature asking for statements. You're on every major network. People want your side." Chuck nodded. "They'll get it, but not through gossip." Torrens hesitated. "You sure about that? You could stay quiet, let the system work. You've already done enough." Chuck's expression hardened slightly. "If I stop now, they'll paint her as hysterical and me as violent. The truth doesn't survive silence." Gina stepped out onto the porch then, wearing jeans and a simple white shirt, her hair tied back. The morning sun caught the faint bruises on her wrists, now fading to a pale yellow. She carried herself with calm dignity, but the quiet fury beneath her composure made Torrens pause. "You both realize what you're stepping into?" he asked. "Once this goes public, it won't stop at the officers. The chief, the mayor, they'll come after you in ways that won't leave fingerprints." "We're not afraid," Gina said. "We're tired of people being afraid." That afternoon, they drove into Austin for a live interview with a national network. The producer met them in the lobby, a young woman who looked barely 30 but carried herself with the brisk precision of someone used to chaos. "We're going to keep it respectful," she said, glancing nervously between them. "No ambush questions, no sensationalism. We just want your story." Chuck's nod was curt. "Then that's what you'll get." The studio lights were bright and cold, but Gina didn't flinch. When the cameras rolled, she spoke clearly, her voice steady even as her hands trembled slightly in her lap. She described the stop, the laughter, the way one of the officers had pressed her against the car while the other turned off his camera. She described the fear not for her safety, but for what would happen if no one ever saw what they'd done. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She simply told the truth. When the interviewer asked how she felt seeing her husband arrive that night, she hesitated, her eyes softening. "Relieved," she said finally. "Not because I thought he'd fight them, but because I knew he'd make them see what they'd done. My husband doesn't lose control. He just reminds people what control really looks like." Chuck said little during the interview. He sat beside her, hands folded, eyes fixed on the host with that same calm that made people both admire and fear him. When asked whether he regretted physically confronting the officers, his reply was simple. "I regret that they forced me to. But when you see someone you love being hurt, you don't wait for permission to act." The broadcast aired that evening. Within hours it went viral. Millions watched the quiet strength of Gina's testimony and the unyielding calm of Chuck's gaze. Support poured in from across the country. Veterans, families, women's rights advocates, ordinary citizens who saw in Gina the face of every injustice that had gone unseen. But for every message of support, there were threats, 2 anonymous calls, slurs on social media, whispers that the Norrises were trying to destroy good officers. The backlash didn't surprise them. It only confirmed what they already knew. The system they were fighting wasn't built to surrender easily. The next morning, as the sun rose over the ranch again, an unmarked car idled near the gate. Chuck watched it from the porch for almost an hour. It never moved. When he finally walked down the driveway, the car drove away, leaving only tire tracks in the dirt. "They're watching," he said later to Torrens over the phone. "They'll try to intimidate you," Torrens replied. "They're desperate. The mayor's office is panicking. We found payments kickbacks tied to every wrongful arrest that went through Mallory's department. Your wife's case cracked it open. And now? Now we go to war." The investigation deepened. Records surfaced of falsified police reports, manipulated dash cam footage, missing evidence logs. A pattern emerged so clear it couldn't be denied. The city's private detention contract paid bonuses for each repeat offender, and officers like Bradley and Cole had filled quotas by turning ordinary traffic stops into arrests. The mayor and Chief Mallory had pocketed their share quietly, cloaked in bureaucratic language about community safety initiatives. Gina became the public face of the reform movement. Every day brought new interviews, community meetings, and press conferences. She didn't like the attention, but she used it. Her speeches were calm but cutting, her words measured and deliberate. "This isn't about one woman's fear," she told a crowd outside City Hall. "It's about every person who's been told to stay quiet when power was abused. Silence doesn't keep you safe, it keeps you small." Chuck stood beside her during every appearance. He spoke rarely, but his presence spoke for him. People trusted what they saw in him: strength without arrogance, conviction without politics. Reporters started calling them the Iron Couple, a name that made them both uncomfortable but carried its own momentum. Meanwhile, Mallory's circle began to crumble. Officers who once boasted of their loyalty turned on him under pressure. Files that had been lost appeared in anonymous envelopes on Torrin's desk. The mayor, cornered by the investigation, held a press conference to deny everything. But by then, the evidence had already reached federal prosecutors. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the last light fade from the fields, Gina turned to her husband. "Do you ever wonder how it came to this? How people can wear a badge and forget what it means?" Chuck stared out at the horizon, the wind ruffling his hair. "Power doesn't change people," he said. "It just shows who they really are. But sometimes it takes someone standing up to remind the rest of us what right looks like." She leaned against him, closing her eyes for a moment. "You think this will really change anything?" He didn't answer right away. "It'll change something," he said finally. "Maybe not everything, but something." In the days that followed, the arrests came quickly. Chief Mallory was taken into custody first, the news flashing across every network in the country. The mayor resigned 2 days later, citing health reasons. The city council called an emergency session to dissolve the private prison contract. And for the first time in years, the people of that small Texas town began to believe that accountability wasn't just a word for speeches. Yet even as justice moved forward, the cost of it weighed heavy. Their privacy was gone. Their peace had been traded for principle, but neither regretted it. They had stood their ground when it mattered most, and in doing so, they had ignited something larger than themselves. Late one night, long after the news vans had left and the phones had stopped ringing, Gina stood alone on the porch again. The fields stretched silent beneath the moonlight. She thought about the road where it had all begun, the flashing lights, the laughter, the moment her phone had shattered, and she realized that she no longer feared that memory. It wasn't the end of something, it was the beginning. Chuck joined her, standing quietly at her side. They didn't speak for a while. Then she said softly, "I used to think strength meant not needing anyone. Now I know it's the opposite." He slipped his arm around her shoulders. "You were strong before I got there. I just helped you finish what you started." She smiled faintly. "Then we finish everything together." He nodded, the faintest shadow of a smile tugging at his mouth. "Together," he repeated. The night wind carried their words out across the darkened fields, across the empty roads where justice had once been mocked and was now being reclaimed. Somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote howled, a sound raw, fierce, and free. It was a sound of survival, of warning, of change. And standing there beneath the stars, Chuck and Gina Norris knew that what had begun as a moment of humiliation on a quiet Texas road had become something far greater. A reckoning that no one could stop, not even those who had once believed themselves untouchable. The courthouse in downtown Austin stood like a relic from another age, a grand sandstone building with pillars worn by decades of heat and protest. The morning sun caught the marble steps and made them gleam, as though the place were trying to remember what justice used to mean before men began trading it for favors and influence. Gina stood at the bottom of those steps, looking up, her reflection caught in the glass of the tall courthouse doors. She could see the faint bruises on her wrists still, almost gone now, but they reminded her why she was here. Behind her, Chuck stood quietly, dressed in his dark suit, his presence steady as a shadow. Reporters lined the street, microphones raised, voices murmuring as cameras clicked. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Inside, the air was cool, smelling faintly of polish and old wood. The sound of footsteps echoed off the marble floors as federal agents moved through the hall, escorting Chief Mallory and the two officers who had once thought themselves untouchable. Mallory looked smaller now, diminished by the weight of exposure. His once immaculate hair was thin, his eyes darting, searching for allies in faces that no longer met his gaze. Bradley and Cole followed behind him, their uniforms stripped, their hands cuffed. For the first time, they looked human, afraid, uncertain, hollowed by the realization that they had become the villains of a story they thought they controlled. Chuck watched them pass without expression. His jaw was set, but his eyes held something colder than anger. Judgment. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that remembers. Torrens approached from the corridor, his badge clipped to his jacket, his expression taut with the fatigue of months spent navigating politics and resistance. "It's all falling apart," he said quietly. "We got them on federal charges, corruption, falsified arrests, unlawful imprisonment, bribery. Mallory signed off on everything. The paper trail's a mess, but it's enough." Gina exhaled slowly. "What about the mayor?" "Gone," Torrens replied. "He resigned to spend time with family." "But the Department of Justice isn't buying it. He'll face charges too." Chuck nodded once. "Then it's time for the truth to finish its work." They sat through the first day of the hearing in silence. Witness after witness came forward, former officers, city employees, even one of the prison executives who had finally decided to save himself by cooperating. The room was thick with tension, the low hum of voices rising and falling as evidence was read aloud. Emails, bank transfers, falsified reports. Each piece another nail in the coffin of a system built on arrogance and greed. When Gina took the stand, the room fell silent. Her voice, when she began to speak, carried a calm that was both fragile and unbreakable. She told her story exactly as it had happened: the flashing lights, the laughter, the broken phone, the feeling of metal cutting into her skin. She described the silence of that road, the humiliation, the disbelief that people sworn to protect could take such pleasure in destruction. There were moments when her throat tightened, but she never faltered. Chuck sat in the front row, his eyes locked on hers, steadying her every time the memory threatened to pull her under. When she finished, the courtroom was still. The judge thanked her, his voice subdued, and she stepped down. As she passed the defense table, Mallory avoided her gaze. Bradley, the younger of the two officers, looked up briefly, his face pale and drawn. For a flicker of a second, she saw something that wasn't mockery or hatred. It was shame. It wasn't forgiveness, she felt, not yet, but it was the beginning of something close to release. That evening, the courthouse steps were crowded with reporters again, their questions like a swarm. Gina answered none. She and Chuck walked through them, hand in hand, past the lights and the microphones, into the waiting car. Torrens followed them out, nodding toward the crowd. "They're not after blood," he said. "They're after hope." "You gave them that." "I didn't give them anything," she said quietly. "They already had it. They just forgot." The trial stretched over weeks. Each day peeled back another layer of deceit. Files buried for years surfaced in evidence. The city accountant confessed to falsifying budget reports under pressure. An officer broke down on the stand, admitting that the chief had ordered quotas of arrests based on profit projections. The words made headlines across the country, sparking outrage and investigation in other cities. The ripple effect spread far beyond Austin. At home, life became a strange rhythm of chaos and stillness. Some days the house was full of journalists, lawyers, and activists. Other days it was only the two of them, sitting by the fire, watching the flames dance in silence. There was a comfort in the quiet moments, a recognition that they had survived something meant to break them. One night near the end of the trial, Gina couldn't sleep. She went outside barefoot, the cool air washing over her. The sky was clear, the stars bright enough to see their reflection in the pond beyond the porch. Chuck followed her a few minutes later, his steps soft on the wooden boards. "You're thinking again," he said. "I can't help it," she answered. "Tomorrow they'll read the verdict. After everything, I should feel at peace. But I keep thinking, what if it changes nothing?" He stepped beside her, looking out at the still water. "It'll change something. It already has. Do you really believe that?" "I do," he said simply. "Justice isn't about punishment. It's about making the truth impossible to ignore." She looked up at him, the moonlight catching the silver in his hair. "You always make it sound simple." "It's not simple," he said. "It's just worth it." The next morning, the courtroom was packed. The judge's voice was steady as he read the verdicts. Guilty on all counts. Mallory's head bowed. The two officers stared straight ahead, their faces blank, as though their minds had already left the room. The murmurs rose behind them, reporters scribbling, people exhaling years of frustration in one collective breath. When the gavel struck for the final time, Torrance turned to them. "It's done," he said softly. "They're going away for a long time." Gina didn't smile. She just nodded, her eyes wet. "Then maybe someone else will be safe because of it." Outside, the air was electric with noise, cheering, shouting, the flash of cameras. Reporters pushed forward, shouting questions. "Mrs. Norris, do you feel vindicated?" "Mr. Norris, what's next for you? Do you think justice was served?" Chuck lifted a hand, and the noise dimmed slightly. His voice carried easily over the crowd, firm but calm. "Justice isn't a feeling," he said. "It's a choice, and it's one we all have to make every day." The words spread through the air like a ripple. For a moment, even the cameras seemed to pause, recording something more than sound, recording the weight of conviction from a man who lived by it. In the days that followed, the story dominated national news. The city of Austin announced sweeping reforms in its police department. Federal oversight committees were established. A new chief was appointed, a woman named Aisha Grant, a veteran officer with a reputation for integrity. She met with Gina privately before her swearing in. "You changed the narrative," Aisha said. "People won't forget this." "I don't want them to forget," Gina said. "I just want them to remember for the right reasons." At home, the quiet finally returned. The reporters left, the phones stopped ringing, and the nights grew peaceful again. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset burn gold across the sky, Gina spoke softly. "Do you ever miss who we were before all this?" Chuck looked at her, then shook his head. "No, because who we were then couldn't have done this." She smiled faintly. "And who are we now?" He thought for a long moment before answering. "Just two people who didn't stay quiet." For the first time in months, she laughed, an easy, unguarded sound that filled the space between them. It wasn't victory that made her laugh, but release. The kind of relief that comes not from revenge, but from knowing that truth, once spoken, can never be silenced again. That night, she dreamed of the road, the same stretch of Texas highway, the same wind through the grass. But in the dream, there were no flashing lights, no laughter, no fear. Just the quiet hum of the world turning and the steady rhythm of an engine carrying her home. When she woke, the dream stayed with her, soft and warm like a promise. Chuck was already up, sitting by the window, reading. He looked at her and smiled. "Sleep better?" "Yes," she said. "Finally." He nodded. "Good. You've earned it." She sat beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder. The house was silent except for the sound of morning birds beyond the window. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed, and the day began like any other. But for them, nothing was ordinary anymore. They had seen the worst of what people could become, and they had answered it not with despair, but with truth. As the light filled the room, Gina felt the last pieces of the past slip away. There would still be memories, some sharp, some fading, but they no longer held her. She was free, and that freedom, she realized, was the truest justice of all. The weeks that followed the verdict unfolded like the long exhale of a storm finally spent. The chaos had quieted, but the silence it left behind was not emptiness. It was the sound of a world slowly beginning to mend itself. The city of Austin buzzed with new headlines, new promises, new leadership. But for Chuck and Gina, Life returned to something simpler, more grounded. Their days began again with sunrise over the ranch, the smell of coffee drifting through the kitchen, and the easy rhythm of chores that asked for nothing more than patience. Yet beneath that simplicity ran a new current of purpose, a quiet certainty that what they had lived through had not been in vain. One morning, as mist clung to the fields, Gina stood barefoot on the porch watching the horizon. The grass shimmered with dew, and the horses moved lazily in the paddock. There was peace in the air, but not complacency, peace that had been earned, shaped through pain and persistence. She could hear Chuck in the barn, the familiar sound of a hammer striking wood as he worked on repairing an old fence. For the first time in months, his movements were unhurried. The tension that had shadowed him since the night of the arrest had finally eased, though traces of it remained in the set of his shoulders. When he emerged from the barn, his hands dusty and his shirt damp from sweat, he looked toward her and smiled. "Fence is finally straight again," he said, wiping his brow. "It was never about the fence," she replied, smiling back. He chuckled softly. "Maybe not, but sometimes fixing something simple helps you forget the things you can't fix all at once." She nodded, understanding. There were still scars left by what had happened, both visible and unseen. The community, too, was healing. Strangers wrote to them every day letters of gratitude, of outrage, of stories from others who had suffered in silence. Gina read each one carefully, her heart heavy but hopeful. Some days she cried over them. Other days, she answered, her words a small comfort to people who needed to know that change was possible. One afternoon, as she was sorting through another stack of letters, one caught her eye. It was from a young woman in Houston named Erica, who had been unlawfully detained years earlier, but never had the courage to come forward. "When I saw you speak," the letter read, "I realized it wasn't too late to stop being afraid. You didn't just stand up for yourself. You stood up for all of us." Gina set the letter down, her fingers trembling. It was then she knew what she had to do. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, she found Chuck in his workshop, sanding the frame of an old rocking chair. The light caught in the dust, turning it golden. "Chuck," she said quietly, "I've been thinking." He looked up, sensing the weight in her voice. "About what?" "About all these people, the ones who write to us, the ones who don't. They need help, real help. Lawyers, counselors, someone who will believe them before it's too late." He leaned against the bench, arms crossed. "You want to start something?" She met his gaze, her eyes steady. "A foundation, a place where people can go when no one else will listen. We could fund it ourselves, start small, build it right." He smiled, the kind of smile that came not from surprise but from recognition. "You've already decided." "I have," she said, "but I don't want it to be about revenge or politics. I want it to be about dignity, about making sure no one has to live through what I did." Chuck nodded slowly. "Then we'll do it." Over the following weeks, their home transformed from a quiet refuge into the heart of something larger. Lawyers from Torrance's network volunteered their time, and activists across the state reached out. Together, they built the blueprint for what would become the Walker Foundation for Justice, named not for recognition, but for what it symbolized: endurance and honor. Gina spent long hours drafting its mission statement, her words simple but resolute: to give voice to those silenced by abuse of power and restore faith in the system meant to protect them. When the Foundation's website launched, it crashed within hours from the flood of visitors. News outlets reported on it, praising Gina's courage and Chuck's steadfastness. Yet neither sought the spotlight. Their satisfaction came from the letters that began arriving again, this time not of despair, but of gratitude. One evening, Torrance drove out to the ranch. He looked different now, less burdened, more at peace. They sat on the porch as the sun sank low, painting the sky in bands of orange and rose. "You know," he said, "most people would have walked away after the verdict. They would have said it's someone else's problem now." Gina smiled softly. "Maybe, but someone once told me that justice isn't about feelings. It's a choice you make every day." Chuck gave a faint grin. "She's been quoting me all week," he said. Torrance laughed, shaking his head. "Well, she's not wrong." He grew serious then. "You changed the way people see this city. You gave them something to believe in again. That's rare." After he left, they sat in silence. listening to the hum of cicadas in the warm night air. The stars appeared one by one, scattered like quiet promises across the dark. Gina leaned her head against Chuck's shoulder, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think it'll last? What we've built?" He took a long breath before answering. "It'll last as long as people keep believing. That's all anything ever needs." Days turned into weeks, and the foundation grew. They held community meetings, organized legal aid clinics, partnered with schools to teach young people about their rights. Gina found herself standing before crowds again, but this time it was different. There was no fear, no trembling in her voice, only conviction. She spoke of courage, of responsibility, of the power of ordinary people to hold the powerful accountable. Her words carried far beyond Texas, reaching hearts across the nation. Chuck supported her in quiet ways. He handled logistics, trained volunteers, fixed what needed fixing around their small office downtown. When reporters asked why he stayed behind the scenes, he'd only smile and say, "Because she's the story now." Sidictanum. But there were moments in the stillness of early morning or the hush before sleep when the memory of that night still came back to her. The laughter, the cold steel of the handcuffs, the helplessness that had once filled her chest. Yet even then, she no longer saw herself as a victim. She saw herself as proof of what resilience could become when joined with truth. Months later, on a bright spring day, the foundation hosted its first community outreach event in the very courthouse where her case had been heard. The building had changed, its walls freshly painted, its staff newly appointed, but the ghosts of the past still lingered in its halls. As Gina took the podium, she paused for a moment, looking out over the faces gathered before her. Lawyers, officers, students, families. Some she recognized from her own ordeal. Others were strangers whose lives had been touched by her story. 2 years ago, she began, I stood in this very building as a woman who had been broken. Today I stand here not because of what was taken from me, but because of what I refused to surrender my voice. And I promise you this, as long as I have it, I'll use it for those who don't. Applause filled the room. Somewhere in the crowd, Chuck watched her with quiet pride. He knew that this was the real victory, not the verdict, not the headlines, but the courage to keep standing when the world had tried to silence her. That evening, when the crowds had gone and the courthouse stood empty again, they walked together through the quiet streets. The city lights shimmered in the puddles left by a passing rain, their reflections winking like stars brought down to earth. Gina stopped and looked back toward the courthouse steps, now silent and still. Funny, she said softly, how the place that once made me feel so small now feels like part of me. Chuck slipped his arm around her. That's because you took it back. You didn't let it own you. She nodded, her gaze drifting toward the skyline. Do you think Mom would have been proud? He smiled, the kind of smile that came from knowing the answer without needing to say it. She already is. They drove home in comfortable silence, the windows down, the warm Texas air carrying the scent of rain and wildflowers. As they pulled into the driveway, the moon hung low over the fields, casting silver light across the land. Gina looked at it for a long time, her heart full but calm. Later, as they sat together on the porch, she spoke again, her voice thoughtful. You know what I've learned through all this? What's that? That strength doesn't shout. It doesn't come from anger or pride. It's quiet. It waits. It listens. And when the time comes, it speaks the truth, even if no one wants to hear it. Chuck nodded slowly. You've always had that strength. You just didn't have to use it until now. They sat there until the night deepened and the stars multiplied overhead. The world around them was still imperfect, still full of battles yet to be fought, but it no longer felt hopeless. There was work to do, and they would keep doing it together. When the wind picked up, rustling the trees, it carried with it the faint echo of that night long ago, the hum of an engine, the sound of boots on gravel, the quiet words of defiance spoken through pain. But now that echo didn't bring fear. It brought resolve. It was a reminder that the line between darkness and light was drawn not by circumstance, but by courage. And as the first light of dawn crept across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold, Gina and Chuck sat side by side, hands intertwined, watching the world they had helped change awaken once more. In the stillness, she whispered, almost to herself, "Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply refuse to stay silent." Chuck looked at her, pride and tenderness mingling in his eyes. "You didn't just refuse," he said softly. "You taught the world how to listen." Natural. And as the sun rose higher, spilling its warmth over the fields, the echoes of their strength stretched far beyond the ranch, into the hearts of those who needed it most. The storm had passed, but its lessons would endure. What began on a dark Texas road had become a light that would not fade, a testament that justice, once awakened, never sleeps again. If this story moved you, don't just scroll away. Hit subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Share this video with someone who still believes justice matters. And check out the other stories waiting for you on this channel. Each one will make you see the world a little differently,